3, 2, 1.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our speaker series to our Gender, Socialism, and Post-Socialism group. And I am excited to welcome our speaker today. Farah Karapetian is an artist and a public thinker based in California who works with narratives of human agency. She holds a bachelor's from Yale University and an MFA from the University of California at Los Angeles. Her work is in multiple public collections, including Paul Getty Museum and the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. She has received fellowships from the Fulbright Program, Russia 2018, the Pollock Krasner Foundation, the California Community Foundation, and the Center of Cultural Innovation. Her writing about visual and civic experience has been recognized by multiple publications and by the Creative Capital Warhol Foundation Arts Writers Grant Program. And I got so excited about introducing you that I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Feruza Aripova. I just defended my PhD in world history at Northeastern University, and I'm currently based in New York City. And I welcome everybody to this talk, and I open the floor to Farah to talk about cotton and my former respective homeland, land of Uzbekistan, and its Soviet and post-Soviet implications. So without further ado, Farah, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Aripova. And thank you also for your guidance and your mother's guidance when I was in Uzbekistan. That was invaluable. I am going to share my screen because my lectures are always very visual. So we need that. What is this? Yeah, okay. All right. Let's see. You Don't Have to Believe Me is the title of this project. In Bukhara, Uzbekistan, a woman sang to me the Roma song she remembered from the bus she took with her high school classmates every September on their way to pick cotton. With her family, she spoke Tajik.
Восток зарей окрашен, спит табор кочевой. Никто любви не знает, цыганки молодой. Эх, най-ни-най-ни-на-ни-нам, эх, най-ни-най-ни-на-ни-нам. Никто любви не знает, цыганки молодой.
In Tashkent, a young Uzbek man said that every time he hears World Behind My Wall by the German punk band Tokyo Hotel, he sees the cotton fields and thinks about what he and his friends were laughing at while they tried to pay regional locals to stuff their bags with white gold. Another person said tape recorders were only for the rich, so we did only live singing. The loudest among us led, singing Suv Kalari Moridan, and we all in unison picked up and continued. This is an Uzbek language song. People also sang the Soviet love song about war, Katyusha, in Russian. And a song about an eaglet. Eaglet, take off above the sun and look at the steps from the heights.
Орленок, орленок, взлети выше солнца, и степи солнца гляди. На реке веселые хлопцы, живых я остался один.
There are as many experiences on the cotton fields of Uzbekistan as there are languages to tell them in and songs to trigger their memories. I am from California, the southwestern coast of the USA. I lived in Uzbekistan only in June 2022 on residency at the Ilham Theater in Tashkent, funded by the innovative nonprofit group CEC Arts Link. I named the project I worked on there after the first line of a poem that the American writer Langston Hughes wrote while in Uzbekistan himself in 1932. You don't have to believe me, he begins, but we're stronger than thunder cutting heaven. Who? We who feed and dress everyone else, the pack mules of the world. Only now you'll follow us, past and future, watching our dust. Writing that, he was in the throes of faith that the world was changing, especially inspired by the notion that under the Soviet system, cotton farmers would now collect not for the aristocratic bays, but for themselves. The worker is the owner, he wrote in his journal. He saw also that streetcars were no longer segregated, with Uzbeks free to sit where they liked. Observable facts like these were harbingers of a future, not just for Central Asia, but I think he thought for the states. Observable representations of this process, like the theater of Umarjon Ismailov in Tashkent, inspired him. In Southern California, soon after that, he would write Blood on the Cotton with Ella Winter and Anne Hawkins, transposing the didactic strategies of early Soviet creative production to his own and my own more familiar border with Mexico. So both the Soviet promise and the American dream fail to circumscribe human experience in the regions shaped by their legacies. I find it helpful not to look at them as the binaries that are supported by propaganda. You'll see me here look first at the past, at a large gesture that the systems shared. In short, they used photography to sell the idea of manufacturing a border, a country even, to produce raw material for their primary benefit. And then I'll walk you through Central Asian circumstance today because we're at the Davis Center and not focused so much on California. And we'll talk about two linked representations, Ismailov's and Hughes. And then I'll move to my own project, why I see a kind of a slant rhyme between then and now, here and there, and what people in Uzbekistan told me happened, not despite, not irrespective of what system was in charge, but like anyway, what happened anyway. And that's what really interests me and what the last kind of 10 or 15 minutes here will reveal in the modality of my artwork. So to begin with imperialism and liberalism, as of Hughes' writing, Russia and the United States had for 80 years been mapping and classifying the deserts they wanted to occupy, irrigate, and make productive for their benefit. The two powers were eliding local land use patterns as they made plans to codify what the lands were called, how they were divided, where the water came from, where it went, and who benefited from its product. This work would reach multiple states of crisis by the 21st century. This includes ecological and economic outcomes of monocropping and its withdrawal, as well as irrigating deserts. So on the left here are pictures of a pre-industrialized cotton in a section on Uzbek trades from Konstantin Petrovich von Kaufmann's ethnographic study of Uzbekistan as the first imperial governor of the region. From the moment of photography's invention, it accompanied imperialist projects in this taxonomical way. I hope you'll see eventually that my methods turn these material processes of the original processes of photography in on themselves. On the right here is just one example, a little hint of an equally early study of how to conquer the deserts of the Americas to plant, among other things, cotton, including, of course, the area that became known unironically as Imperial Valley, which is where Hughes' play is set. We wouldn't recognize this similarity at the beginning in either location, and maybe we largely still don't, in part because the propaganda of each side is so impenetrable that it's almost unrecognizable as such. This latter issue is my concern as an artist, that in both superpowers today, even it's hard to see our own propaganda as it unfolds. Art is responsible for reflecting on images and political postures that circulate, reflecting on the content itself and the materials through which the content is conveyed, and the circulation and conveyance itself, what gets circulated, and what doesn't. So this is a Soviet book on Uzbekistan, and this is an image from California, Coachella Valley, and some of the wells that were being touted as possible in the desert. Commissioned by governments and circulated according to their purposes, Max Alpert's and Dorothea Lange's photographs show the building respectively of the Fergana Canal in Uzbekistan and the All-American Canal in California. And yes, it's called the All-American Canal after being rerouted from Mexico. In addition to showing the projects themselves, they also describe both countries' aspirations and the influence they wanted to inspire in their viewers. I mean, if Benedict Anderson's Imagined Communities was like a poster, it would be this picture on the left of someone reading a newspaper in Russian and Uzbek to the people of the fledgling Uzbekistan while they ostensibly construct their own future. The governments wanted to expand their territories and consolidate their power, but the photographs become a fourth wall. You're not supposed to see through them. They're supposed to be fact. Max Alpert and Max Penson's photographs of smiling Uzbeks hacking away at the sand, and Dorothea Lange's photographs of hungry farmers waiting for the soil to settle, are all the proof viewers need that the construction sites they photographed bode well for a better future. The pictures are almost like a closed ethical loop. They're the justification, the proof of concept, the proof of execution of the regime's projects. Soviets simply responded better to like happy people and US voters to sad ones, but of course they're both propaganda. So in June 2022, long after processes of cultural diffusion have confused the Soviet promise and the American dream, and since Uzbeks have picked cotton under feudal, imperial, socialist, and capitalist systems, but picked cotton nonetheless, I wanted to find out what multiple generations of people in Uzbekistan actually remembered of their experiences on the cotton fields beyond binary Cold War narratives or their neoliberal wake. So I brought with me cyanotype emulsion to photographically fix the postures these people remembered from the fields onto photographically sensitized local cotton. That means that anytime you see blue in this lecture, like Ikat, Mickey up here, that's my work. Cyanotype is an original process in photography used among other such processes on exploration trips by colonizers. It's portable and more ecologically friendly than later chemistries. And it doesn't require photographic infrastructure like a darkroom. All you need to make it work is a way to get it on a surface, in this case fabric, and then water and sun. I wanted to use it to reference those original imperial processes, but in such a way as to suggest a knowingness on my part that I was an outsider. I wanted to use it visibly, transparently, in order to break the ethical loop in my creative production, and indeed break that fourth wall between audience and object. While I was preparing to do this in Uzbekistan, there were shows locally of artists concerned with the topic, and this is a poster for one of them. There's documentary photography there, like Victor Ans of the Aral Sea, which is an outcome of the monocropping, of the irrigation, which I saw at another local show, and Kamila Rustamekova's of the cotton harvest. There's a documentary film now in circulation as well, Cotton 100%, directed by Michael Borodin, which handles experiences of and activism around cotton harvest. And there's the wonderful photography of Besod Boltayev at the Bukhara Photo Gallery. In art more broadly, one finds Dilyara Kaipova's resist dye patterns, which is ikat, that borrow from iconography like the Kremlin's architecture or the symbol for radiation. Another would be contemporary artist Said Atabekov's traditional Uzbek coats, chapans, made from US marine camouflage. So clearly artists inside Uzbekistan are concerned with cultural diffusion and their region's agency with respect to global superpowers. These are artworks made by insiders to this conversation, people who have the right to criticize now what maybe generations of others couldn't. I want to start now by recycling then to this kind of origin story, this origin story of the parallel between my work and Hughes' work, our time and their time between the world wars. So first of all, Langston Hughes, why would this writer, who our US high schools associate so narrowly with Harlem, have gone to Uzbekistan, and what did he come away with? He traveled to the Soviet Union in 1932 to make a film critical of race relations in the States, which didn't end up getting produced, in part because the Soviet Union wanted American help on engineering projects, and in part because it was a dumb script. Hughes would see living newspaper works by the Blue Blouse Group and watch rehearsals at the Meyerhold Theater, where the relationship between the stage and the proscenium and the auditorium was constantly being rethought, and where news footage would play on video screens above the action, as in Window on the Village here. You can actually see that footage online now. Among the many productions and rehearsals he witnessed on his travels immediately before he wrote Blood on the Cotton, though, were two very specific works. He was definitely held in his hand and mind Черные, Белые, Black and White, this misguided film script from the state in Soviet Union, and Umarjon Ismailov's Spoilers of Cotton, which he saw in Uzbekistan and wrote about for Asia magazine in 1934. Black and White script rushes through this kind of tam-tam drum version of the Atlantic slave trade and soon finds itself on the cotton fields in the southern US, where our Civil War is resolved with a handshake between a wounded southern farmer and a radiant northerner standing over dead African Americans. A banner waves over the screen with text by Marx. Almost the entire rest of the story takes place decades later at a steel mill. So despite Hughes' entirely appropriate reaction to this script's astonishing historical and cultural inaccuracies, the text demonstrates didactic strategies at their extreme, rendering them really visible. It checks the boxes of racial cooperation towards the shared goal of liberation from the capitalist oppressor, the prioritization of action over religious faith, the use of newspapers on screen to communicate a present urgency and relevance to the information conveyed, and the use of discussion between characters to demonstrate the kinds of questions one might pursue to encourage the proletariat in our struggle. More convincing to Hughes on a literary and also probably human level, however, was Ismailov's Spoilers of Cotton. Hughes writes that he sat with Ismailov and his wife in Tashkent, drinking tea and sweet wine and eating plov. He writes that Spoilers of Cotton is an important play because it reflects the new social order, shows clearly the value of cotton to the economics of socialism, and pictures vividly the fight that had to be waged against the counter-revolutionary elements that sought to destroy and sabotage cotton production in an effort to break down the first Central Asian Workers' Republic. Uzbekistan was designated a nation state in order to provide the Soviet Union with cotton as raw material. The play was written 6 years later, inside the first 5-year plan, and so of course it supports that end. The play is also, however, one of the only texts from that moment in time that actually outlines what real people were worried about. Characters in the play, including a wealthy one who's only pretending to be a laborer, his actual character name is Fake Laborer, sow doubt with respect to the wisdom of planting exclusively cotton. They worry about starving, right? Will the system really provide them with food if they don't plant wheat? They worry about who's cheating the system, wetting their cotton to make it heavier or getting paid more or less for various varieties. They worry about who will actually prevail. Soon, says one of those who doubt socialism's future, they will kill all the Bolsheviks and the wives who threw off the veil. These characters even go so far as to burn 10,000 pounds of cotton to prevent a young socialist from trading it for a village tractor. Their goal is to stop the collective farm from forming and the cotton program from taking shape. A crew of the most dedicated nationalists even show up in their wives' burqas holding bread and saplings. Inside their disguises, they hide pistols and rifles with which they're going to try to kill the guy who was going to take the cotton to the city to trade for the tractor. But it only takes a few lines of the dialogue to end the play. with Soviet militias driving these enemies of the people off stage and the young characters proclaiming, "Long live the new life in the village, the collective life." Still, it's all of those kinds of concerns that really stay with you after reading the play. Hughes' work in California shows influence in both content and form from the work he encountered in the USSR, along with his draft of the play Blood on the Cotton in the archives at Yale's Beinecke. Are multiple newspaper clippings about the 1933 cotton laborers' strike in California. He kept them not only as a resource for the writing of the play, but as potential stagecraft. Blood on the Cotton opens with the suggestion that the audience as well as the stage be used, that the old frame of the proscenium be broken. Between scenes, a newspaper curtain might be used, reproducing actual portions of the reporting of the strike. Bits from the strikers' handbills or from the vigilantes and growers' advertisements could be flashed on the screen. So this obviously demonstrates the influence of the living newspaper theater in the Soviet Union, the stagecraft of productions like Meyerhold's Window on the Village, and even the use of newspapers as cutaways in the script for black and white. Hughes writes also in the opening passage of his play, if possible, one or two Filipinos might be included among the strikers to add to the melting pot of races that is California's low-paid agricultural reserve. The play is didactic in its strategies of communicating the problems intrinsic to exploitative capitalist scenarios. From the very first scene, Mexican laborers whose car has broken down on the highway explain that they can't get to work without gas, and they can't afford gas to go to work. White laborers pull over, but they don't want to give gas because they don't have enough for themselves. So over the course of Hughes' play, Mexican, white, and black laborers narrate their untenable conditions and the circumstances that led to them, including growers sending agents to Washington asking them not to limit immigration so they could get plenty Mexicans and Filipino boys to pick cotton and grapes and lettuce. Hughes is not an insider in the cotton context in Uzbekistan or the fields of Calexico. He never tries to write as if he identifies as an Uzbek, Mexican, or field hand, but he pushes back on questions of race and the role of nationality in ascriptions of value, even as he focuses on the labor and humanity of the characters. In actual fact, in his Vigilantes Knock on My Door of 1934, he describes the way in which race did actually impact this play. Vigilantes began to target him as a Black man associating with communists and labor strikes, and indeed, the play was not produced. Hughes' commitment to labor and its conditions, as well as his interest in the Soviet promise, were longstanding. He went to the Soviet Union more than a decade after John Reed's 10 Days That Shook the World shook Hughes High School too, which he writes in his autobiography. He was interested in observing multiple solutions to the problems of racial capitalism all over the world, and he found what he perceived as a functioning state of progress in Tashkent. The interest, again, predates that trip, as evidenced, for example, in the way his advertisement for the Waldorf Astoria in the New Masses specifically points out the hypocrisy of the moneyed classes. Also influencing his desire to check out the Soviet Union is this, his respected friends that are there, this success in the Soviet Union while the US experiences the Depression, plus Black American workers being hired there as skilled humans with value to contribute to a society that would remunerate them as due. He sees this too, communists in the States associating with a cause he cares about, the Scottsboro Boys, and communists in Russia showing solidarity around that case as well. Even in Uzbekistan, yes, this is an Uzbek poster about the Scottsboro Boys that somewhat confuses their plight with bread and Nazis, but why not? It's solidarity. That is all why he went, but readers of his work of the 1930s tend to cordon it off as if it's the political work of Langston Hughes, this period. The bigger picture is that Hughes is reading and writing in an intellectual milieu that includes W.E.B. Du Bois's contention in 1926 that all art is propaganda and ever must be. Hughes writes always politically, insofar as the relations between people are politics, whether his subject dwells more on Blackness or broader inequity, and whether his ear is influenced more by the blues or the blue blouse. Indeed, Hughes' writing is famously responsive to oral vernaculars. And while in Soviet Union, he listened to the sounds of didactic theater. He translated Vladimir Mayakovsky's Black and White. And on his return to the States, he co-writes this Blood on the Cotton with these sounds and strategies very much in mind. He wanted to find strategies to effectively communicate about the proletariat in the US at a moment at which all over the world, politics seemed as at a turning point. Fascism was on the rise, but so were questions of decolonization and enfranchisement, from the Black internationalism of the Clam Art Salon in Paris, which you see here in one of my previous projects, The Godmother, to the pan-Turkic and pan-Islamic sentiments and efforts of Jadidism in Central Asia. So this brings me to now, right? Why me, why now, why here, why there? For well over a decade before my trip to Uzbekistan in 2022, I'd been asking my peers to use their muscle memory in order to access events in their lives or images that circulate with which we wanted to spend more time. Here's a picture I saw online, for example, of riot police being stoned by protesters in Kyrgyzstan. I bought my friends riot shields and helmets and exposed their shadows on photographic paper. This kind of cameraless photographic transcription results in something called a photogram. I found over time, though, that the dialogue and performative strategies we enacted together remained private, as did the specifics of the spaces they remembered moving within when the stories were their own and not sourced from the news. When I was in Russia for the first time in 2016 with the CEC ArtsLink back apartment residency, I happened towards the end of my stay on Meyerhold's work in biomechanics. Again, something that Langston Hughes would be seeing while he's there. Actors practice the breakdown of particular gestures that would train them to privilege movement over words on stage. And the psychophysiological bent of this practice really rhymed with my work. So I wanted to use Meyerhold's techniques to access contemporary experience. I thought that despite his execution in 1938 and the lasting dominance of realism in the theater, his physical language would be a link between my practice and local creative language in Russia. So I returned to St. Petersburg in 2018 on a Fulbright fellowship, inviting theater worker Catherine Sisuyeva to co-create with me. She guided the participants through a brief introduction to biomechanical principles and led improvisational workshops towards a performance that integrated the language of biomechanical etudes into other related physical theater styles. We called it a living seminar. When the pandemic began, I continued to dwell on this period between the world wars, but I had no bodies available to me to reenact postures that meant something to this. And I investigated instead the networks of women who had moved ideas around enfranchisement around the world during this period, including the Nardals, who translated Langston Hughes' work and initiated ideas of Black internationalism in Paris at their Clam Art Salon. The research and the pandemic circumstances, as well as a project I did around my father's death, again, no body to photogram, led me to make cameraless pictures that relied on collage rather than bodies. I stayed with this idea of what people do anyway, even when circumstances around them are war, colonization, and sexist disenfranchisement. Among other things, they're willing to migrate, to take on the unknown when their circumstances compromise their growth, their lives, and their instinct to protect. So what do our political moments share, this period between the world wars and our current epic right now? When did I go? I traveled to Uzbekistan just 4 months after the Moskva was sunk by Ukrainian missiles, at which point the word cotton took on a new meaning in Ukrainian slang, as you'll see here, and I can go back to that in questions if you want. I traveled a year after quarantine restrictions, at least for travelers, were lifted in Uzbekistan, although there was still some evidence of COVID-19's touchdown on our planet. This looks totally galactic to me. I also traveled less than a year after the Taliban had retaken Afghanistan. And of course, Uzbekistan is sandwiched between these regions. I traveled a year after the United States Capitol was attacked by supporters of Donald Trump. And as I flew from Southern California to Istanbul en route to Tashkent, another of the United States' many mass shootings claimed the lives of 19 children and 2 adults. In California, the number of people without a place to live is impossible to ignore, as protests in defense of Black lives, anti-fascism, anti-capitalism, decolonization, and basic human rights to asylum, housing, food, education, and healthcare mounted not just at home, but all over the world. It seemed to be a moment to return to this pivot point in our shared history, one in which these same questions of the dream, of the promise, of fascism and decolonization seemed to bear some response. So one goal of this project is to stoke dialogue locally about histories that may not be commonly transcribed, even internally, here and there. For that reason, and because of the multiple languages in which people might feel more comfortable speaking, the interviews in Uzbekistan were conducted by people intimate with those being interviewed. 12 interviews, 3 young women, 2 of whom I paid and 1 of whom refused payment. These women had not actually grown up picking cotton. Why? In 2007, an NGO called the Cotton Campaign began focusing on Uzbek fields. What became a global boycott that lasted from 2009 to 2022, I think, sustained by an international community ostensibly concerned with the conditions of Uzbek labor. During this period, the second president of Uzbekistan initiated reforms in the country that led to the lifting of the boycott. Thus, fewer people now pick cotton than had done so before. But as became very clear in even the run-up to my residency, cotton touches everyone in Uzbekistan. Even if they no longer leave school in the fall to collect for the state, it's on the plates and the shampoo bottles, the markets, and it's by the roads, not tucked away. Not like it is here. Still, there are differences between the generations who all picked and this one. At one point in the interviews, a young artist interviewing a woman who collected in the 80s points out one difference. She says, "It seems to me that your generation of history is more spicy than mine. Now it would be more difficult to adapt to these conditions. People are more individualistic. Then they were doing something together." The woman replies to her, "Everyone rallied." And the girl adds, "Collectively." And the woman, "Everyone supported each other." And the girl, "And now it's every man for himself a little." The dates of these harvests described in these interviews ranged from 1976 to 2002. And thus the speakers would have lived through major events like the Soviet-Afghan War, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the difficult 25-year rule of Uzbekistan's first president, and certainly the music, a little bit of which you heard at the beginning, reflects those events, the music they mentioned. Participants not only sent me music, but also videos on the internet that corresponded with the time periods they remembered picking cotton. I edited these 2 kinds of appropriated content together to make a video through the viewing of which you can literally watch and hear regimes change. If in the beginning the songs reflect Soviet pride and the videos are produced by the state to reflect the efficient science of the industry, later songs reflect internal Soviet rebellion and the increasing influence of the West. Plus, the videos move towards self-produced VHS tapes of young people treating this like summer camp. At the culminating opening for my residency, this video screened to give visitors a chance to connect to one phase or another of their own history as co-produced by participants. Also at the opening, a local musician read passages from the narratives and sang several of the songs, while a local movement artist enacted narratives behind a cotton curtain as a live shadow play. The narratives themselves, and here we get to the actual prints, do not reflect a sense of the speakers as victims or heroes. That binary is for competing institutions, and it did not seem to occur to the speakers to characterize their lives that way at this time. Even so, I noticed 2 other binaries at least emerge. One was the generational divide noted above, and the second was that of the difference between the experience of those bussed out to the field to pick cotton and those living on those fields already. Urban and rural divides had real presence in these narratives now, and clearly missing from my interviews that I could accomplish in a month is the testimony of year-long farmers rather than only those for whom this was seasonal. And as quite a few of them referred to it, compulsory volunteering. This, of course, has to do with my networks, where I was staying, how long I was there. But it became very clear that that would be something else to pursue. Before this opening, just in terms of what I produced there, I had purchased panels of locally produced cotton, resist dyed in colorful patterns with the local ikat technique, onto which I painted the cyanotype emulsion described above. I isolated passages from the narratives I had heard and discussed with participants how they might embody the stories. Again, thinking as I had in terms of the photogram. I placed my handwritten passages of the interview's text in Russian alongside the bodies on the fabric while it was exposed to the sun. And I hope this picture makes sense as an explanation. I was influenced in this decision by miniature paintings I saw in artist studios in Bukhara and museums, wherein Arabic text always has a graphic place alongside figurative representation. Both are divorced from deep space in terms of Western perspective, which I preserved as well in these photograms. Experimental as this process was, it was another step through which to discuss the stories, embody them, and so crucial. And these stories are so crucial to the place at which this country has arrived economically, ecologically, and interpersonally. So I wanted more time and space to explore them with people. I exhibited these panels at the gallery at the Ilham. I hoped that in hanging my panels in this gallery, I would simply contribute more catalysts to this local conversation already underway about what cotton means and has meant over the last 100 years. In fact, I left these panels there, and I don't even know if they survived a fire at the theater later that year. The stories that I chose to make in person at the theater dealt with love, sickness, unity, and misunderstandings. I have also now remade these panels at home in a different way. Here, I sprayed the cyanotype emulsion onto cotton rag paper so that it does not entirely reveal the images I'm describing, to hint at their second-hand nature, and again, reveal that fourth wall between viewer and what is essentially a manufactured photograph. Because now the images won't be viewed by a population that shares verbal languages, these new drafts include no text and more specific collaged imagery. My goal here is to create pictures to which people from multiple backgrounds can relate, and yet to retain the specificity of the interviews. My goal here is actually also to have people see the fabrication of the photographs, and thus recognize that all photographs are fabricated, even when they tell a true story, much as in the theatrical techniques of the revolutionary period. When people recalled their sense memories from the field, they often described the season. Do you know why the cotton was picked specifically in autumn? Because the heat of the day changed into the cold of the night, and again the heat next morning, which made the kesek burst and open. When the cotton was open, it was wet. One could even squeeze the water out of it. Autumn sometimes stretched into winter for the harvest. One person who describes cotton, or who picked cotton in the early 90s, describes this as the most difficult times of the country. In the dawn of our independence, when the economic crisis was harsh, stores barely had anything but cockroaches running around. And on many collective farms, instead of money, flour was given as a salary. But for the harvested cotton, we were still paid with money. We started to collect usually from September 20th, sometimes even from September 5th or so until November. This person said, though, that their generation didn't have to pick cotton in the snow of December, but previous generations had to go on the fields, even in the snow and the frost. Indeed, testimony from a cotton harvest of 1976 to 77 supports during the time of Rashidov, supports this narrative. It was a really hard time. Even if there was no cotton left in the fields, we were kept until the end of December, until they received an order from the center to stop the work. So we had to extract the remaining cotton from kesak, which is an unopened cotton boll. It was considered a very low quality and ranked as 3 or even 4. This is a moment in history particularly marked by scandal. Almost all arable land was used for cotton production. Indeed, a woman says, because there's cotton planted everywhere and there was not any spot left that would not have been planted with cotton, farmers didn't have pastures for their livestock. If they themselves planted something like potatoes or onions, they were called enemy of the nation. The land was only for cotton. Still, the state planning committee demanded increases in the harvest. The same woman recalls there was also this poisonous pesticide with a very nasty smell called dust. It was sprayed from planes into the fields, even when people were working there. A lot of people fell ill with lung diseases after that. After independence, they stopped using it. Someone from 1976 expands on the winter harvest, and her story was so beautiful. Obviously, there were difficulties. We had a collective mission to collect 6 tons, but there was little cotton left on the fields by that cold time. I will never forget, it was already snowing. It was cold. 2 guys got on a horse, tied a rope or something between themselves, and raced through the beds to remove the snow over the cotton bushes so that the girls' hands would not freeze when they picked cotton. We made a bonfire on a field with dry bushes and warmed ourselves there. 2 of those interviewed had actually gotten sick and left the fields. One who harvested in 2011 left after 9 days, presumably with permission, because he suffered no consequences from his departure and expressed no resentment of the period. The other person had collected cotton in 1982 when she was 18. She said that at first it was tolerable and that once every 10 days she could go home, but a month passed and then another, and in December, unable to stand it, having left home for a vacation, she never returned. She fell ill with hepatitis, but when the polyclinic learned that she had run away from the cotton harvest, they refused to initiate an official sick leave until she turned up yellow and ended up in the infectious diseases hospital. This person worked with her mom already as an economist, and thus her mom was summoned to a meeting of the party committee. I was almost expelled from the Komsomol and demoted, transferred from the position of an economist to the position of a typist. When I returned to work, they treated me like an outcast of society. The director of the institute respected her mom, though, since she held an important position, and advised her to fire her daughter of her own free will, recommending that she instead be employed in a military organization where agricultural work was not an additional service requirement. The person providing this interview summarizes this experience by saying that she worked in the Defense Ministry from 1983 to 2005 and rose to leadership positions, and says, I found my happiness in my personal life there. For most of these 12 people, the fields had no such radical outcome. People often described trying cognac on the fields for the first time. In the 90s, it was white stork, and the speaker was 16 years old. She said older guys who had gotten out of the army brought the treat and that her head was blown straight away by the drink. Another speaker from 1987 says that guys who went through the Afghan war were picking alongside her group. It was not the first time they had gone to the cotton fields, and they took care of us, she said. They knew how to get everything. They brought Armenian cognac and taught me to drink it and then eat it with lemon. She also says one of these soldiers was her first love. One of them men played guitar. He had Jewish, Armenian, French, Russian blood and an unusual name. Everyone fell in love with him. All the girls melted, and everyone was waiting to see who he would pay attention to. He decided that he would take care of me. I was so excited about it. She said, we had an absolutely innocent relationship. He treated me very brotherly. For me, he was some kind of deity because he'd been in the army. He was so brutal, handsome. He'd seen life. This sharing of food reflects a feeling frequently expressed in these interviews, one of unity. The man who was sent from college to Rikabad in the fall of 2011 said, it so happened that, for example, there, meaning at school, Russians communicated with Russians, Uzbek with Uzbeks. And at that moment, it turned out that we were all together as one big group. We rallied, of course, we helped each other there. There was bread for someone, toilet paper for someone, some chocolate. That is, we somehow had everything in common. If someone needed a bottle of water there, then they helped out. That is, we had everything in common. In this regard, we really became friends. I'm saying if this weren't the case, then there would be Uzbeks separately, Russians separately, Koreans separately. But this time we're all alike. We rallied as a single team. Yes, cotton unites. Only very occasionally did these positive youthful memories veer towards political affiliation per se. A speaker from 1963 Harvest said, "We not only picked cotton, but also played basketball, volleyball, and even put on a stand-up show, had a disco. We sang Turkmen songs and patriotic songs by Victor Tsoy. At night, we went out to play the game Friendship. I wish I could return to those times. There was a lot of filling and tasty food. Parents often came to visit us. No one wanted to run away. Everyone picked cotton collectively, sang songs on the field. We had a strong feeling of duty towards our homeland. We proudly worked for the benefit of the country's economy. For us, the country created all the conditions." The person who collected in 1987, however, said no one had the goal to help the motherland and collect pure cotton and set records. In general, people did not go for this. That is, you were ordered to go and you decide how you'll spend the time. It was necessary to find some advantages in this, and we did. We found it. One of the people interviewed told a story of her mother's from 1976. She said that a local girl told her mother that city people wouldn't be able to pick cotton. Her mother was from the Tashkent region, a part that was still considered to be the city of Tashkent, while the girl was from Surkhandarya. They made a bet, and the girl picked 214 kilograms of cotton, while her mother picked 236 kilograms. She said that those who picked more cotton at the end of the week or the whole period were awarded with gifts, a pencil case, school supplies, even a television. In this case, said the girl, Tashkent won. There was, however, perhaps increasing over the decades, more often than not, this report of a difference between the recruited students and the farmers themselves. In 2011, locals would come up and offer 40 kilograms in bulk. Anyone could buy it and relax instead of working hard picking cotton all day. They knew that we were just guys from Tashkent, that we didn't know how to pick cotton, that we worked very slowly. They thought we were very slow. We were working at our pace while they were really like robots. They were picking very fast. They got the hang of it. We, on the other hand, could only pick one cotton boll at a time, spending at least 5 or even 10 seconds on each. By the 21st century, then, recruits had become a we and the locals a they. The college sent a police guard to work night shifts in 2011 because the administration was concerned that locals would bully or rob their students. In 2015, a man reports that one of the challenges we were told to be aware of was defending our girls, since some of the locals happened to flirt and show signs of interest to our girls. He does go on, "We were aware of our rights, though, in contrast to the villagers. I feel so sorry for those whose story is not like mine, those who were really forced to pick cotton since they had no other choice." In thinking about the fields in 1987 with respect to the local farmers, a speaker said, "But have you ever really had such a thing that you somehow encountered them? We didn't cross paths at all. We apparently were released into one field and them into another." The feeling about the locals was not negative, though. In general, there was admiration for the family's generosity to the students who, the families would house them. However, like small, rudimentary housing, and they're still housed, and their hard work ethic from children to elders inside these families. There's a lot of admiration for that. The system, however, introduced generations of students who were increasingly distanced from the notion of the land to a population who lived by it. One man's story from 2011 is one of my favorite stories, and it exemplifies this tension. We were young. We were from Tashkent. We worked slowly in the field, and we would break cotton branches when picking cotton. We weren't very careful. When the farmer saw the end result, he started crying. It was for real. When he saw what we had done to half of his field, he sat down and started crying. We asked him if something wrong happened. We thought he was robbed or attacked or even worse. He told us that we had broken all the cotton branches, and those branches were alive. The plants could have produced crops for another 3 years, and we broke all the branches. At that moment, I felt ashamed of what we had done. We didn't appreciate his hard work. He could have lived off that cotton field for another 2 or 3 years. We were there to pick cotton and help him with the harvest. Instead, we destroyed his field. I felt very bad about it. After that incident, I would never destroy anything, as I learned to appreciate other people's hard work. If, for example, I see a painted curb, I would never step on it. I'd rather jump over it because I understand that someone put effort into it. I will always keep that in mind. Okay, don't freak out. All right. Future. All right, this is a vintage Lenin in a market. So while it's tempting to tell you more about the theater written by insiders in India and Tanzania and other places where cotton fields and irrigation projects were begun by liberal governments to describe there are plays that actually pick up on that narrative in all of these places and describe local conversations around agency on the cotton fields. I feel like for the purposes of this lecture and also for my project, it's more right to bring it home. I live in California, not not far from the parcels of land that concern Langston Hughes. If they were irrigated and planted around the same time as were those in Uzbekistan, so too they were relieved of cotton at around the same time as well. And I say that in a kind of a compromised way because they were relieved of cotton on the American side, not the Mexican side. Bringing the project home with me, I'm taking the same steps I made in Central Asia with former cotton field workers on the border between California and Mexico. My questions now are, will their memories too flesh out the last 100 years with a sense of humanity missing from all institutional propaganda? Will their experiences resemble those of the Uzbeks more than those experiences purportedly described by booster photographs? Can I find a way to weave these stories into a final performative form that borrows stories from Uzbekistan and Calexico against the ground of Hughes and Ismailov's plays? Can we hear our similarities historically and humanistically if for some reason it's always been so difficult to see them? Can local artists and laborers remain agents in this production even while I offer a transparent synthesis of our overlap beyond the kind of calcified narratives of our nation states? Thank you.
Thank you so much. I mean, that I am slightly overwhelmed, I guess, because of the whole deluge of memories of, being a student in school and being led by our teacher to pick cotton, I don't know, at the age of 12. And, my mother and her continuous trips to pick cotton as a student at the medical school, along with my father, and it was sort of this romanticized view of that campaign. And I think it is such an important and critical contribution to this current process of decolonization that sadly only happened in the wake of Russian aggression against Ukraine. And of course, the Baltic countries, they sort of went on that path of decolonizing and refuting the Soviet past way earlier. But just thinking back, I mean, the Russian imperial expansion into Central Asia in the 1860s, right? At the wake of the Civil War, at the wake of the global shortage of cotton, and it's Russia's colonial desire to have, cotton in their backyard, which sort of was inherited by the Bolsheviks, right? Except it sort of turned into this romanticized view of fulfilling the quotas, of, going onward towards the bright socialist future, etc. And with that, you have an enormous, awful impact of the policies, including the drying of the Aral Sea, the child labor. I mean, you've touched upon so many of those elements. So I thank you. This has been, as I said, sort of a memory lane for me, and I really want to open up the floor for questions. But one of the things, so we have the first question. Elizabeth Wood, hello. She says, I am curious to hear more about your title. You don't have to believe me. What does it mean in the context? And thank you for a great talk.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I had one slide at the beginning that kind of gives a literal reason for why I used "you don't have to believe me." That is one of the poems that Langston Hughes wrote and left in Uzbekistan during his trip, and I can find the text again if it would be helpful. But Kevin Young prepared that text in English with the translation. Let me see if I have it. Which slide is that? There it is. There it is. You don't have to believe me, the poem begins, but we are stronger than thunder cutting heaven. We who feed and dress everyone else, the pack mules of the world. Only now you'll follow us, past and future, watching our dust. And I first of all adore that poem. Second, I adore the circumstances of my reading of it. The fact that he left it there, almost, I mean, kind of in a similar way. I left my ikat there, but he left it there. I think, if I'm remembering correctly, it was actually transcribed in Uzbek and it had to be translated, and Kevin Young prepared it in English. So it was only available to us fairly recently as one of Hughes' poems. I'm also really interested in why he would have started the poem that way. You don't have to believe me, but basically the proletariat's going to lead the world now, and you'll see it. You don't have to believe me, but you'll see it yourself. But of course, there's another reason why I used it as the title for my project there. The title for this lecture is Who to Cotton, and that's because of one of the interviews where a student said that in school the teacher would come into the class and say hlopok, and the kids in the back would like raise their hands and say that they wanted to go. But my project is called You Don't Have to Believe Me, because I am not the person you although I am a mediator of this information, and I want you to be very conscious of my mediation. The stories are not mine, so you don't have to believe me. There are other people's narratives that are coming through this, and also I am trying to be very transparent about the fabrication of the final product, so that it's an inroad for you to find out more about the artists that I listed here who are local, or any of these histories. So yeah, it is a title that I hope covers a lot of ground, both referencing 1932 and also my insistence on multiple subjectivities.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for the question. Farah, I'm curious, where are you taking this project further? Where are you heading with that? I mean, as I said, there's just so much content.
Yeah,
which
I know.
is incredible.
My brain likes to synthesize lots of disciplines, and so so there is a lot of dense material in this 45 minutes, and I'm really curious to see if it does, if any one of those disciplinary trajectories kind of begs further question from anyone here today. But yeah, my goal right now is to spend the summer in Calexico and Mexicali, looking at the same kind of process, making the same kind of prints from interviews, and collecting also a sense of the musical history of whatever generations want to respond. And then the goal is to turn it into a part of it, part of its prints and part of its performance. So in the fall, I'll be at Princeton for a week working on an enactment of at least part of the vocalization, whether verbal or musical, probably both, with Mitch McEwen, her project BIM. So yeah, it's going to become an embodied performance, and I need the summer to work on the musical component and the kind of staging of this, which will borrow from that revolutionary staging, incorporating screen and shadow. Mm-hmm.
And personally, I would love to see the exhibit, being advertised within the Uzbek community here in the US, because it speaks widely to the politics of memory. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure so many people, again, as like myself, would have the same experience, sort of being overwhelmed with this deluge of memories from the past and the stories of their parents and grandparents. I would personally would love to see a visual exhibit of this because I think it's incredibly powerful. I mean, in the context of the memory, in the context of decolonization, in the context of coloniality.
Yeah, no, I want to show like just in a gallery the work as well. And I just have to find the right context for that. I think it would be really nice to have both the Uzbek prints and the California ones in the same room with the narratives, and as well as any kind of performative aspect, because yeah, then these places can stop being so siloed. You know, I think it's really easy to be like, oh, the Soviets did this over there, or oh, the Americans did this here, or oh, the Germans did this in Tanzania. I mean, everybody did it after the US Civil War. Everybody wanted to go find places to you know, exploit. And so instead of simply, you know, saying that this is a project of this or that regime, looking at it as a whole, I think, or even just two systems in comparison with one another, and the actual human narratives that that are not part of that system's narrative, I think it can help like beg the question of what's a way forward, you know, beyond institutional ideas about what that way forward should be, right? I mean, if it's not going to be a return to indigenous farming alongside a moving Colorado River, what else could it be that actually centers the people's experience in these areas instead of the markets that drive institutional projects? Even the withdrawal of cotton and what that does to an economy. You know, I mean, I think sometimes the solutions aren't necessarily improvements. I mean, they are improvements on one level, and then they are clumsy in others. All right. Yeah. Well, I hope to show it in New York. Yeah. To find a place.
Okay, if you have any questions, please type in your questions into the Q&A box. Yeah. I guess continuing with the sort of the theme of decolonization, and you traveled there in the summer of 2022. What was the sentiment like with people you spoke? I guess, was there a point of awakening in some way? You know, because as you know, you mentioned some people were sort of critical towards the past, but this is sort of more of a recent sentiment. So perhaps you could elaborate on that.
Yeah, I mean, it was a really interesting moment to be there because, you know, war in Russia, Taliban in Afghanistan, I didn't know what just even globally how that would impact Tashkent. And there were a lot of Russians down there opening bank accounts so that they could operate outside of Russia. And then there were apparently, you know, I was told, I have no basis for comparison or data, but I was told that there is more of Islamicization of the kind of secular Muslim majority state that people are used to. So those two things maybe are circumstantial to the right nowness. But in terms of the relationship to the past and the future, I feel like, you know, there were definitely people who came at this as if like, you know, forced labor must be stopped, child labor must be stopped. You know, we've got to continue to explore this and find other ways of handling our economy. And then there were other people who seemed to say that these words are very Western words, and that you know, there are families that simply live in extended family situations, and children have always been on the fields with their parents, and maybe there's a different way to structure a school system so that they don't start in September or something like this. I think for me, listening to people, and again, not being able to say one way or another what I think is best, because I'm not going to be implicated in whatever the outcome of those decisions might be. Listening to it, I felt as if the question is far more nuanced, right? It's not just a question of forced labor. It's a question of who's working, like if the state is no longer mandating cotton as a monocrop, and if the state is no longer mandating, schools busing people in, there are still people who are experiencing this rural and urban divide, and experiencing cultural change around family dynamics, and maybe the attention need be paid to when a colonizer pulls out, what do they leave in their wake? Why not blame Uzbeks per se for the way that they're doing their farming? There's 100 years of history here. You can't just say, oh wow, you did this bad, you're doing this badly now. And now you just need to change. So we're, the boycott itself, I'm sure it was helpful. I'm sure it's done good work in terms of preventing bad labor practices. But I also don't know the full story there. How much of other countries' raw material was therefore privileged, while Uzbekistan's economy, already crippled by 100 years of colonization, now suddenly had to figure out a way out. Do you know what I mean? Like, it seems like it's a more nuanced problem than simply like, let's boycott forced labor. There's some other kinds of ways in which history needs to be repaired and compensated for, or people there need to be able to weigh in on how to evolve politically. But yeah, everyone seemed really interested in talking. I think only one person said that that one of the people they wanted to interview didn't want to give an interview when they learned I was from the States. that was a thing, but I expected that to some extent. And I only hope that there are more and more memory studies experiences happening in Uzbekistan. I know that hasn't always been an academic driver, but it's so important before people die.
Thank you. Seems like we don't have questions, but I perhaps can ask one of the last ones, and perhaps somebody else would pose a question. So you've done your visual exhibit at the Ilhom Theater, which perhaps to notify our listeners that it is an experimental theater founded by Mark Weil that continued to thrive despite the government censorship. And it was founded in 1986, right? And then one of the things I touch upon in my dissertation is Mark Weil's commemoration of Uzbek queer past and the contested tradition of the boy dancers. And in particular, I talk about the play Ecstasy with the Pomegranate about Ustomomin, a Russian artist who converted to Islam and who was fascinated with the whole tradition of the boy dancers. And Ilhom commemorated that queer past, despite, again, as I said, it's contested, etc. But it was there, whereas now it's been completely denied, right? There's still criminalization, etc. So, I mean, I was thrilled when I found out that you would be holding that exhibit at the Ilhom Theater, because it's such a place of defiance in a way, you know, when it comes to art defying censorship on so many levels and commemorating the past despite how conflicted it might have been. So perhaps you could elaborate on your experience working at Ilhom and having that exhibit at Ilhom Theater.
Oh yeah, it's such a wonderful place. They do such wonderful work. I mean, CEC ArtsLink as an institution funding all these kinds of experimental practices in the post-Soviet world alone is really, really wonderful and interesting to collaborate with. And I've done it several times in several places. And it's always a process of exchange, right? That's never just a one-way street. You're always finding ways to bring people around in multiple modalities and places. But the Ilkham also, as a cited thing in Tashkent, is really just a bastion of experimental practice. And every night was another play. I only managed to see a handful of them because I was trying to turn out all this work in a month. But they were all just completely new stagings every night in the theater, and just incredibly engaged community of viewers there for that. So yeah, it was a really wonderful place to make the work, to show the work, and to let local performers kind of define how that performance would be with the content that I provided from my editing of what people gave me. So that was really, really fruitful. It was interesting to bring the cotton conversation to the Ilkham, because before I went, obviously I had to talk to them about, talk to Irina there about what I wanted to do. And when I first said I wanted to work on cotton, there was a little hesitation for a second, because although, the country is now out of its boycott and everything's moving along, it's still a touchy subject, and people, I think, still want to be careful about how they approach it in order to continue to function independently. As you say, Ilkham is the first independent theater. It has survived many, including its founder's murder, many different kinds of struggle, moments of struggle. And I didn't want to compromise that for them. I didn't want to be the American artist who arrives and creates a problem. Nor did I want to create a problem for any of the people interviewed or interviewing. So I wanted to make sure that this was a way of approaching it that was okay with everybody there. And when I described how I wanted to handle it, like from the people's side, immediately, director was not only comfortable but excited about it. She had stories she wanted to share. So it's not that it's no longer political, because everything is political, but it's no longer, I think we always think in terms of like, how is this going to approach a state narrative and therefore be dangerous? But if under these circumstances you are centering a human narrative, it doesn't directly do anything that could compromise their position there, and that was good. Although they did have a fire. I don't know how that fire started, and I don't know if my work burned up, but that's okay. It was made as an experiment. None of that work was, I think, the kind of stuff that would really make sense to an audience away from that moment. It was an experimental way to begin the project, and I think now the work is more articulate and just visually kind of translatable across cultures.
Thank you. And we have one more question from Rochelle. With the war in Ukraine and the emigration of many Russians to Uzbekistan, is there more discussion of Uzbekistan and other Central Asian states becoming tech hubs and diversifying the economy away from cotton and agriculture?
Good question. I am not an expert on the economy. I did definitely sense a lot of, I know that cotton is now no longer certainly emphasized in the planting, that the government has enabled more input from local farmers to decide on their own crops. But I definitely saw that in Tashkent and Samarkand there were major conferences happening around other parts of an economic ecosystem. Sure, tech would be one of them. I mean, listen, even here in California, where the Salton Sea has been kind of compromised, to say the least, by the irrigation projects that happened at the same time. Just this morning, I received an email from someone saying, don't you think the Sultans, and these are some articles about how the minerals that have been deposited in the Salton Sea or accumulated there can now be used for lithium farming. So I think there will always be a way to turn even the disasters ecologically that are the kind of byproduct of these colonial projects into new markets, potentially energy or tech markets. Yes, absolutely. And I won't be the one to figure out what those are, but I'm curious too. Well, thank you very much, Fedoz. This was a lovely opportunity for me to share. I know we'll probably end now, so I just wanted to invite people to ask me any questions after this over email as well, because I know that my brain synthesizes a lot of things very densely, and I really do want to know in what way it would be interesting to kind of open this project up beyond the artwork, if it would be useful to people to see the plays alongside one another in a publication. I have so much content here. I can make a show that doesn't have any of this, but would that be something that would be interesting for anybody else? Good to know.
Yeah, also perhaps you could put your email in the Q&A if you want to share your email, or people can reach out to you. I am personally very grateful for your time and this fascinating and very multifaceted talk that touches upon so many important current issues. I wish you would continue with the project and take it to another level. And I am excited and very much hyped to see what the final outcome would be.
Yeah, my email is just my name at Gmail. So Farah Karapetian, Gmail.
All right, good.
Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Farah. And thank you so much to the Davis Center for this opportunity. And I guess I have to thank the WeWork for the space that allowed us to have the talk. So thank you so much, Farah. All the best to you, and we'll be in touch. And thank you to everybody who participated.
Thank you. Bye.